Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Machine to Move Ocean and Earth, The Making of the Port of Los Angeles and America, by James Tejani. Narrated by Jonathan Todd Ross. Introduction. Excavating the Lost Coast. It was no place for a harbor. He said so until they stopped asking. Now, the Port of Los Angeles was under construction. Promoters hailed its artificiality. They predicted it would be, upon the opening of the Panama Canal, the premier harbor of the Pacific coast. The port, they said, signaled the United States' rise to global prominence. Yet for him, the port marked an ending. George Davidson, famed geodesist and the West Coast's only resident member of the National Academy of Sciences, had lived to the year 1911, long enough to see numerous marvels of history. He was 86 years old, frail and nearly blind from a career that depended on his eyes above all else. Over 6 decades he had traveled 400,000 miles, equivalent to 16 times around the earth in pursuit of knowledge. Visitors to Davidson's home near Lafayette Park in San Francisco noted how his memory remained sharp as a blade. That gave him comfort. But there were unknowns, irksome things beyond his view. Despite Davidson's accolades, he felt estranged from the world of his old age. History seemed to grow distant, like a steamship heading off to the horizon, while he watched it move on without him. Things had been different in 1850 when a ship first brought him to California. He was young then, sent out by the government to survey an unknown coast. His work would bind the recently conquered territory to the United States, fulfilling the nation's expansionist designs. It would require decades and measurements by the tens of thousands. Through his efforts, pieces became one. Some were displaced, however, pushed to the margins or lost. Davidson could still see them in his mind. He remembered the region's Native Americans. Many were survivors of the Franciscan missions. Others, farther north, nearly killed him to protect their homelands. He recalled Mexican ranchers, some old enough to have sworn allegiance to the Spanish crown. They felt sufficiently secure, even in the wake of the U.S. conquest, to threaten him off their property. Davidson thought of others still, government officers, soldiers, political luminaries, fellow scientists, and business proprietors. He had worked alongside them. Few remained alive in 1911. Most of all, Davidson remembered the wild coast. He had learned its contours like a loved one's face. He had calculated its expanse. He had recorded its indigenous and Hispanic place names so they would not be forgotten. At times the Pacific coast left him awestruck and afraid. It certainly left his body broken. He once knew its secrets better than anyone. Yet his task was to divulge them, so that settlers and commerce might overrun the region. He hoped science would steer all toward a greater good. Instead, fracture and conflict recurred. The nation endured a bloody civil war and the pains of industrialization. Powerful corporate masters arose from the West to bend local and national governments to their whim. They diminished science, at least the public-minded kind Davidson practiced. The country itself, its people also, had changed. Meanwhile, the wilderness of his youth disappeared. Property and capital were everywhere. Machines tore apart the shore or buried it under boulders and concrete. Animal life vanished. Nature's beauty remained, but it was no longer so fearsome. All of this was, on one level, the achievement of Davidson's life. By the 20th century, his maps had made the world smaller and more comprehensible. Ocean and earth moved, joining places and people in ways impossible before. But the world had grown complex also, too vast and faceted for Davidson to take in. That was his life's dilemma. Parts became whole, and as they did, their workings became harder to discern. Nowhere more so, perhaps, than at San Pedro Bay near Los Angeles. It was a site he knew well. Decades earlier, he had written that a harbor of scientific merit could never be built there. Its boosters proved irrepressible, no less. Their success told him that his time had passed, and that stirred memories all the more. Somewhere among them were the answers. What had happened? This book is the first to answer. It explains how people and events transformed San Pedro Bay by the start of the 20th century from estuary into the nation's global gateway. The process culminated in the construction of the Port of Los Angeles, which today operates as a central engine of the U.S. and world economy. The port is all around us. Objects we use on a daily basis pass through it, or through supply chains for which it is an essential node. This is especially true for Americans, with their appetite for East Asian imports. Furniture, apparel, plastics, footwear, electronics, and automobiles top the list. In a recent year, the harbor transshipped $311 billion worth of cargo, weighing 219 million metric revenue tons. San Pedro Bay's port complex claimed 1/3 of all U.S. ocean shipping and a link to 1 in 60, or 2.5 million, U.S. jobs. It is the busiest container port in the Western Hemisphere. Hence it is, along with the Panama Canal, a key component of a machine circulating goods and services, culture and power, across the Pacific and beyond. When cargoes bypass San Pedro Bay, they arrive at places for which it is the archetype, and just a few steps removed on the chain. Even in our digital age, we all have a port somewhere. Despite its significance, the port remains invisible and taken for granted. That is because of its success and our dependence upon it. Without the items that pass through its associated networks, our world is simply unimaginable. Yet the port's absence, out of mind and out of sight, is a result, too, of history. Astonishingly, San Pedro Bay has been left out of American historical narratives. Its story was lost and forgotten, and perhaps never fully understood even by participants. Some disowned it as reputation and politics required. Davidson kept, or was kept, quiet, as time proved him wrong. Silences allowed a local mythology of modern Los Angeles and its enterprising founders to hold sway. Lost is the reality that the making of the Port of L.A. spanned from the estuary to mountains and deserts, across the continent to the Apacheria, to Washington, to New York, and to Civil War Richmond, overseas to Europe, Hawaii, and Asia, and back again. Those places, seemingly peripheral to the bay, often were the cause for its development, and the bay, seemingly peripheral to national and international events, was in fact anything but. This is a story of the United States' formative yet troubled expansion to the Pacific, of its relationship to an envisioned ocean world, and of Americans' attempts to master this world, a story that led early on to San Pedro Bay and continues still. By the mid-19th century, Americans identified the Western Shore as the Republic's grand object, a place of commercial opportunity, as well as a marker of the nation's maturity among nations. They saw this as a unifying project, a way to join the country's fragmented pieces across vast territory, and the divides of party and section. Likewise, they saw reaching the Pacific as a way to evade social inequalities that beset humanity elsewhere. This vision was never quite realized. Instead, Americans' attempts at it tore open gaping divides, over slavery and railroads most of all. Even so, the attempts produced maps, rails, machine technology, capital, and stronger government institutions. Together they shifted the nation westward, and together they focused U.S. expansion and engagement with the Pacific upon Southern California's coast. The result was the port of Los Angeles, an engineering marvel that broke the limits of nature and distance, along with the new metropolis made in part by its claims to an artificial harbor. Both have transformed the United States, providing a foundation for the way Americans live today. But this is a global story too, and one with great relevance. The port continues to shape a troubled relationship between the U.S. and the Pacific. Knowing its origins may guide us through the troubles of our own time. Long before I knew the story, San Pedro Bay took hold of my imagination. A traffic jam of idled ships as the port struggled to keep pace with globalization provided a backdrop to my hours in the surf at the bay's southern limit. From a car window I saw the port's industrial grandeur. Giant cranes, colorful containers stacked high or carried on railways, and lots with hundreds of identical unpainted cars. The clean angles of slips and channels stood out while cresting the suspension bridge over the harbor. Refinery plumes and chemical tanks appeared endless. These visible signs are only a fraction of the bay's tale, however. I set out to understand its unseen connections, to uncover its buried secrets, including the great estuary that once was. That search led me to a set of fragments of oddly connected persons and scattered archival sources: letters, maps, reports, land patents, court papers, memoirs, and newspapers. Each document revealed little, a meaningful phrase, perhaps, mixed among the chatter of long-gone daily affairs. But notes and paper accumulated through years of research. Names, relationships, and life paths drew out in webs. Dates fell into sequence. When aligned, the fragments revealed a previously hidden story of the bay, from the 1850s to century's end and beyond. Like my hours immersed in the sources, this story is one of pieces, and the human need to unite them in meaning. But it is also one of incapacity, the blindness that prevents us from seeing our historical moment in full, and from steering the outcome as we otherwise might. The book's characters continuously found themselves caught between intentions and consequence. We still do. The chapters that follow detail how the port of Los Angeles came to be, from a bay of mud and salt marsh. They tell of an unlikely set of individuals brought together by an estuary, and of contests to control it. The narrative begins in the wake of the U.S.-Mexico War, when the United States first established a claim to the Pacific coast and interior. That claim quickly slid into chaos, as the California gold rush brought settlement, violence, and unfettered development. The U.S. Coast Survey, predecessor to today's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, sent out scientists like Davidson with the hope that its precision maps might bring order to diverse spaces and people. The effort drew Davidson and the survey to San Pedro Bay, and in turn into the Republic's sectional crisis. The Southwest Desert, Southern California included, offered superior access to the Pacific, making it the place where politicians competed to locate a transcontinental railroad and thereby shape Western Empire and federal union. Despite the Coast Survey's hope to keep science pure from politics, its leaders became trapped in the schemes of others. Yet the Southwest was a region where various Americans had to negotiate conquest. The desert represented a borderlands. This key term in scholarship on U.S. history views the Southwest as a place beyond the control of governments at Mexico City and Washington, one characterized by indigenous resistance and local identities that spanned culture and nationality. San Pedro Bay marked its far western edge. Here, Manuel Dominguez and his family controlled a massive Spanish-era land grant. U.S. expansion, science, and sectionalism came to them. Nevertheless, Dominguez embraced the national project, as his family sought to transform their grant into private property. That won them allies among Anglo settlers and real estate developers, but it also put the Dominguez family into contention against imperialist slaveholders like Jefferson Davis and land speculators like Edward Ord, the family's friend, Coast Survey officer, and secret informant to Davis. The political contest over rails and slavery would fracture the Republic and bring on the Civil War. In Southern California, the contest had similar results, while also confounding our assumptions. Expansion and profit made partnerships regardless of the slavery issue, pairing Mexican ranchers with Southern immigrants and a future hero of the Union Army with the Confederate president-to-be. During the Civil War, San Pedro's estuary served as a harbor for the first time, enabling the U.S. government to fight secessionist rebels and to subjugate the indigenous peoples of the desert. That forged a new partnership at the bay, one of speculative business and federal power, that edged out many of the prior players. Local freighter and developer Phineas Banning gained lucrative contracts to supply a Union army commanded by James H. Carleton. Their joint efforts weakened the resistance of the Mojave, Apache, and Navajo, and sped the influx of soldiers and settlers. At the same time, the partnership set up future conflict, as Unionist entrepreneurs like Banning coalesced with corporations such as Leland Stanford and Collis P. Huntington's Southern Pacific Railroad. The company arrived at San Pedro Bay in the 1870s to take control of shipping. It soon monopolized much of California, the coast, and the desert, turning the region into its business empire. Army and government engineers, the victors of the Civil War, tried to harness the power of capital for the nation's purposes. Some already looked to the Pacific. However, whether they were returning scientists like Davidson or triumphant generals like Ord, they were no match for wealthy railroad titans whose influence corrupted public institutions and locked up harbor access and waterfront lands. The reversal of corporate power at San Pedro Bay had an unexpected start in the borderlands property disputes left over from conquest. In 1886, Manuel Dominguez's daughters sued to regain estuary lands that the U.S. had removed from the family's grant decades before. Their suit, decided by the Supreme Court and Justice John Marshall Harlan, enhanced the authority of government at the very moment the United States extended its reach to seize Pacific Island colonies and Asian commerce. As Harlan recognized, imperialism abroad required seaports, and that required public control over the places where ocean and continent meet. Yet harbor development would take much more. Brilliant new technology to tear apart nature and reconstitute its elements. Army engineers like Amos Fries and bureaucrats like William Howard Taft, both veterans of the Philippine War and occupation, would wield immense dredging machines to carve out the estuary's shallows. That gave opportunity to a new speculator. Los Angeles enlarged its city limits to take charge of the bay, and hitched its prosperity to an emerging U.S. Pacific in the 20th century. The Port of Los Angeles is the artifact of this history. As it finally took shape, the actions and motives of individuals had less effect than the port's overall machine-like operation. Cargoes moved by an integrated system of ship, rail, and truck. Mechanization replaced tasks previously done by workers. Large institutions, staffed by interchangeable hires, directed the port. Market forces of supply and demand did too. For this reason, this book does not tell the port's story beyond the first decades of the 20th century. It stops at the estuary's destruction, the moment at which humans severed San Pedro Bay from its natural and indigenous past to make it serve the needs of modern mass society. Stories of lost ecology and of the bay's first people, the Gabrielino Tongva, remain threads throughout. They provide context to the port's making, a counter-narrative no less important, although limited by available historical sources. Despite the intricate logistics and highly managed waterfront that constitute the port today, its history is one of remarkable conflict and adverse consequences. That is the story's great surprise, among many I found. The port emerged against doubts and long odds from a cacophony of interests and events. Most of all, it formed because people aspired to connect the fragments of their world and to gain the material blessings that might bring. Their efforts exacted a price on nature and persons caught in the way. But it often did as well on persons who dared to partake of ambition and risk. Like the people in this book, today's Americans, along with a large share of the world's population, are engaged in similar efforts, even if they are unaware of it. San Pedro Bay is evidence of the human capacity to construct a deeply intertwined existence. Its history should caution us, too, that the world we ultimately make may not be the world we want. So it was in 1871, during the era of nascent American and global connection, when Walt Whitman wrote to celebrate the distances brought near and lands and peoples welded together. Amid his exhilaration about railroads, steamships, and canals, Whitman pondered the reckless soul of ambition, with its unknown paths and ending. In the intrepidness to sail forth, he noted, "We will risk the ship, ourselves, and all. The present is not so different. Ships still press off to the horizon and back again. As people living between past and future, we, too, strain our eyes to see clearly." Part 1. Borderlands. The Invaders. They came by sea. Fur trappers, cavalry, and covered wagons provide the lasting images of U.S. westward expansion. But outsiders first came to California by way of the coast. It was the unexpected arrival of a supply ship that saved the 1769 Sacred Expedition from failure. The Franciscan missionary, Junipero Serra, pronounced it a miracle, and proceeded to set up the first Spanish colony in Alta California. The Yankee vessel Lelia Byrd trespassed through San Diego and San Pedro Bays in 1803, 1 year before Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery started up the Missouri River. 43 years later, hundreds of U.S. troops landed ashore, as Navy Commodore Robert Stockton declared that California was no longer Mexican territory. The soldiers displaced a smaller force led by John Fremont that had trekked across the continent. These Americans of 1846 were forerunners. The discovery of gold brought invaders by the hundreds of thousands. The earliest, during 1848 and 1849, arrived by ship. They took first sight of California from the vantage point of Pacific waters, not the other way around. This was true as well for George Davidson. On a June morning in 1850, he disembarked the overcrowded Pacific mail steamer Tennessee and walked a makeshift gangplank to the shores of San Francisco. He did not look like an invader. The 25-year-old from Philadelphia wore civilian clothes. He carried the instruments, notebooks, and meager salary of the United States Coast Survey. But his bookish appearance masked a taste for adventure and profanity. Like many Americans of his time, he was familiar with outdoor life and adept with a gun. Davidson would need all of his qualities. He came to research in the uncharted wilderness of the Pacific coast. Most gold rush migrants arrived to seize land and resources for themselves. They pushed prior occupants aside and justified this as progress, civilization, and racial superiority. Davidson shared those assumptions, but they were not the larger part of him. Instead, California offered the opportunity to study and banish the unknown. Science was his life's object. He pursued it not merely for himself, but for the U.S. Republic. Davidson was a government scientist. That proved irreconcilable at times. It drove him to overexertion, suffering, and acclaim. His steps held many dangers. They led both north and south, and soon to the estuary at San Pedro Bay. There, Davidson's path would intersect with that of Manuel Dominguez. He, too, was an invader, but without the need to voyage anywhere. Dominguez was a native Californian, as Americans of the era called the Spanish-speaking upper class, and the mixed-race descendant, 2 generations removed, of a soldier who led the 1769 Spanish conquest. He saw Southern California as his birthright, and he wanted more. Dominguez spent his adulthood consolidating a massive land grant, the legacy of Spain's and Mexico's appropriation of native peoples, located on the shores of San Pedro Bay. Using politics and law, he drove off challengers and guarded his family's Rancho San Pedro. But he also grew frustrated at Mexican authorities. U.S. conquest seemed to improve his prospects. Dominguez would succeed, but he would fail too. Both results were set in motion by the young arriving scientist and the instruments he carried. That an estuary brought Davidson and Dominguez together speaks to the complex story of conquest on the Pacific coast. Invasion was most visible in military action and the flood of settlers. Yet its enduring force came by less visible things like law and bureaucracy, the building blocks of order in society. Federal agents like Davidson came to study and catalog. Claimants like Dominguez appealed to a once foreign government to perpetuate their property and privilege. Both looked to piece together California's past into a future they desired. But the more Davidson or Dominguez acted to realize their ambitions, the more they found the outcome beyond control. That caused their paths to encircle, along with many others in far-off places. The story began decades before, with a flawed, though brilliant idea, to fix the American nation. Chapter 1. European Measures, Westward Ambition. The world of 1800 was flat and fragmented, at least on paper. People of the post-Enlightenment age knew the Earth to be a vast globe, but they could neither quantify nor visualize it. Maps of the time falsified space. Worse still, they did so in proportion to their reach. Only the most local of maps, those least in the spirit of discovery, had accuracy. This problem preoccupied European science and its patron monarchs. For the American Republic, the same posed an existential dilemma. The young United States looked west with democratic spirit and desire to overspread the continent. Expansion of that scale might occur, but growth also promised distension, dissolution, and chaos. Its violence might never be calmed. Conceived as a hopeful experiment and imperialist practice, the American nation contained a destructive paradox. In the years before George Davidson's birth, the United States Coast Survey, USCS, set out to solve this problem. Congress established the office in 1807 to study shorelines, harbors, and maritime hazards. The nation was smaller then. Its boundaries ran along the Atlantic Ocean and Gulf of Mexico, with the exception of Florida, Spanish territory until 1819, and Texas. The office worked under the Treasury Department, as its charts would assist in tariff collection. During its first decades, the Coast Survey looked to the Atlantic world and rarely strayed beyond the realm of existing commerce and settlement. It took no role in frontier expansion. That set the agency and its science on a collision with the rising democratic age. Head officer Ferdinand Hassler personified the survey's aspirations and inborn difficulties. He was a refugee from Europe who sought order and rationality in the New World.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?